This episode is brought to you in part by Pittsburgh Seminary's Henderson Leadership Conference, September 22nd to 24th, with Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Attend in person or online for lectures and workshops with strategies for ministry amid political and theological divisions. Visit www.pts.edu/Henderson.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals in the United States tie themselves to the Republican Party. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of Season 6. This is Phyllis Schlafly. We begin today by kicking a hornet's nest, the disagreement between Alice and Esther. Alice Paul was a fighter. When she thought that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was too moderate, she and another woman founded the National Woman's Party, organizing masses of people to picket for women to get the right to vote. Her largest demonstration was in 1913, as 8,000 women marched in Washington, D.C. In January of 1917, 1,000 people, including Alice, picketed the White House for 18 months. She was arrested there and force-fed during hunger strikes. When newspaper accounts carried the story, it earned her sympathy and drew national attention to the cause. Then, with the 19th Amendment, women won the right to vote.
It did something very, very important, which was to remove political discrimination against women. But it did not do anything about the massive numbers of state laws and some federal laws that were discriminatory.
That voice you just heard is Marjorie Spruill, Professor Emerita of the University of South Carolina, and author of the book Divided We Stand. It's sometimes hard for us to comprehend how far women have come. Well, after they had the right to vote, women could not open bank accounts in the U.S. without their husband's signature until the 1960s. Many banks continued to refuse until another law was passed in 1974. Equal pay wasn't mandated until 1963. Equal control over the assets in a marriage, 1981. For women like Paul living in the 1920s, there was still a long way to go.
The National Woman's Party under Paul decided to support a blanket bill, they called it, to try to make all of those discriminatory laws unconstitutional all at once.
But how do you do that? Get rid of discrimination in one fell swoop. For Alice, the answer was total equality under the law. Men and women should be treated the same. Do away with all federal and state laws that say otherwise. Sounds simple enough, right?
They actually called it the Lucretia Mott Amendment, and they hoped it would go through right away. They introduced it significantly at Seneca Falls, New York, the site of the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. They actually had a lot of support from the Republican Party early on for that.
Which is notable. The Republican Party continued their support for equal rights from the 1920s up until the election of Ronald Reagan. Total equality. No difference between men and women as far as the law was concerned. Everything equal. That was Alice Paul's goal. She's probably best known as one of the authors of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. It's pretty simple. It was originally proposed in 1923, but then was reworded to this clearer version in 1943.
Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
Hers was just one idea of how to address inequality. Let's introduce another.
The descendants of the National American Women's Suffrage Association through the League of Women Voters, but especially through the labor movement, were horrified by the idea that you could no longer have separate legislation for women because they felt that legislation that benefited women, that protected them against bad conditions in the workplace and against dangerous conditions, against employment discrimination, etc., that this was going to be a real disadvantage.
This was at the tail end of the progressive era that ran from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Back then, many Americans had an optimistic view of the law. We could use legislation to protect voting rights, improve food quality, curb alcohol abuse, help the poor, and protect those who'd been ignored or taken advantage of.
One of the key victories of the progressive era had been protective legislation on behalf of women.
Should those protections be undone in pursuit of total equality? That was the split. Do we want to be treated totally the same as men, or do we want protections?
The critics of the National Women's Party and the Equal Rights Amendment were saying that this was just absolutely a horrible thing because it was important that the government be able to help women through special legislation for them. So the Democratic Party, which was linked to labor at that point, as well as all the way through up to today, was opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. And this was not any small quibble. This was a very basic thing. And it really divided feminists in America into two very hostile factions that continued to be very at odds about this until the 1960s.
How do you solve this? We sometimes talk about feminism as if it's one united thing. That is incorrect. Feminism has factions, and the early 1900s were no exception. On one side was Alice Paul, who wanted total equality. On the other was people like Esther Peterson, who hoped to preserve protections for women. Esther Peterson was a lobbyist who also worked at the United States Women's Bureau. She played a major role in the election of JFK and advocated that he form the President's Commission on the Status of Women. This started a chain of events that would eventually lead to the National Women's Conference we'll cover next episode. Esther essentially starts the ball rolling that pits liberal feminists against conservative women. What she wants is for the government to investigate the ways that American women are discriminated against and then listen to their needs. Watching videos of Esther, she strikes me as a person who deserves her own episode. She's well-spoken, put together, and knows her stuff. Pay attention here to an interview she did in 1961. She was asked if she believed that the role of women had improved. What kind of legislation does she single out?
We have on the books some laws that really protect women. We have the equal pay law, for example, that there shall be a rate for the job, and it is illegal for two people to perform the same job and there be one rate for a woman and another rate for a man. We say that you can't discriminate against people on the basis of race or religion and sex as well. And we have just now issued the guidelines. I call them the guidelines for the gals, and it will tell and help industry to know what does constitute a discrimination. Why are the women always in the low wage, the low salary areas?
The legislation she highlights here gives women protections in the workplace. Esther Peterson was a labor feminist. She, like many others, believed that women, especially those with low wages and low status, should have protections under the law. Women like Esther tended to be Democrats. On the other side, you had equal rights feminists like Alice Paul, the protester fighter. She believed that special legislation for women undermined their equality, hurt their job prospects. Women with her beliefs tended to be Republicans. Alice wanted no special treatment, total equality. Esther wanted equality plus protections. Both were feminists, but with decidedly different goals. Equality versus equality plus. There was a third option as well. One that stirred conservative women of different faiths and brought them together. It too was led by women. So much of the groundwork that led some evangelicals to support the Republican Party was led by women. The third argument was essentially this: do we even want equality between women and men in the eyes of the law? That option was held by a lady who is often forgotten today. One who was organized, brilliant in her own way, well-spoken, and at the center of not just bringing evangelicals to the Republican Party, but also uniting Catholics, Mormons, and Protestants in a way that men like Harold Ockenga and Billy Graham never could. They wanted to unite religious people around the gospel, and failed. She wanted to unite them around politics. Her name was Phyllis Schlafly. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. So far this season, we've explored how evangelicals tried to unite through revival and the NAE. The country lost its trust in government through the Vietnam War and the crimes of the Nixon administration. The 1960s saw big changes in education as mandatory prayer and Bible reading were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. A boom in federally funded higher education filled universities, which then became hotbeds of protest. There were literal fights over textbooks and who got to approve them. I introduced the idea of the Republican Party's long Southern strategy to court white Southerners by neglecting African Americans. I renewed emphasis on family as the agent of change in the country and the bonding of libertarianism and religion thanks to guys like R.J. Rushdoony. All of these disparate ideas would soon come together under the Republican Party platform of 1980. But the GOP had yet to see evangelicals as a voting bloc. Today, we're going to meet a woman who made the religious right too loud to ignore. She had a difficult childhood, as did many people growing up during the Great Depression. Her sales engineer father lost his job. Here is Phyllis talking about her mother, as told in an oral history recording from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
When the Depression hit, she needed to take a job to support the family, and she ended up spending 25 years as the librarian at the St. Louis Art Museum.
Her father, like so many others, had a hard time holding down work during the economic crisis. A terrible era.
Oh, of course it was. The Depression was tough on everybody. But we didn't get any federal handouts, welfare, food stamps, all of those things. In fact, we would have considered it an embarrassment to be on the take from the government.
To pay for college, Phyllis worked nights test-firing rifles in a munitions plant, then went on to earn a master's at Radcliffe. She worked for a short time as an aide to a congressman in Washington before returning to St. Louis, where she wrote a conservative newsletter for a local bank. It was there that she met her husband.
Well, the way he always told it was that he came down to the St. Louis Union Trust Company one day to find the documentation on something that was said in one of the letters about Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois being a socialist. And he found me.
Because she was the person who wrote it. She and Fred Schlafly married and settled into his mansion in Alton, Illinois, which would eventually become the center of her political operations. They were both strong Catholics in a time in the U.S. when Catholics were feared by many Americans as soldiers of the Pope. They were both strongly against communism, to the point of setting up a foundation to rally Catholics against it, as well as opposing the New Deal and the United Nations. They had connections to the far-right conspiracy group, the John Birch Society. In 1955, she lost her first bid for Congress, and then lost her second attempt in 1970. She appeared on the radio and became a popular speaker for the National Federation of Republican Women, then became the vice president of that group. She was always writing, including a popular 1964 book, A Choice, Not an Echo. The quote on the cover says, "The inside story of how American presidents are chosen." It's basically a conspiratorial screed in which she claims that the presidencies were stolen in 1940, 1944, 1948, and 1960, all of which, of course, were won by Democrats. In the book, she also went after liberal Republicans. I tried to read it, but it's a bit too 4chan for me. Remarkably, she self-published A Choice, Not an Echo. In an interview on C-SPAN, she was asked what her plans had been for the book.
Well, tell the members of the Republican Party and those who would be delegates to the convention how the conventions had been stolen in prior years by the New York Eastern Rockefeller establishment.
You might remember Nelson Rockefeller from my episode on the Southern strategy. He was a liberal Republican who, at the time, was running for the party's nomination against the far more conservative and openly racist Barry Goldwater. In A Choice, Not an Echo, she advocated for Goldwater and against Rockefeller.
But there was a quality about that book. It changed people. It changed them from being Rockefeller or Johnson supporters to become Goldwater supporters,
helping to get Goldwater the Republican nomination. Its sales exploded thanks to a friend in California
who called up and said, I read it. I'm going to a UROC convention this weekend. That's United Republicans of California. Air freight me out 5,000 copies. And so I loaded them up in my station wagon, took them down to the airport, sent them out there, and that weekend we had statewide distribution in California. And the California primary was the first week in June, and we sold over 500,000 copies between the 1st of May and the 1st of June in California.
And she was off to the races, literally impacting the nomination of a major party candidate with books shipped from her garage. This was a continued theme of her career. Schlafly didn't need traditional media outlets, just connections and a mailing list. Her candidate, Barry Goldwater, lost his run for president, and the liberal and centrist arms of the Republican Party did what they could to keep Phyllis from power. She had been next in line for president of the National Federation of Republican Women. When she lost, she and 3,000 of her supporters marched out of the conference. She started her own organization, the Eagle Forum, complete with her own newspaper, called the Phyllis Schlafly Report. She had a penchant for conspiracy and drama. But you know what she wasn't interested in at the time? Women's rights. But that was about to change when she came up against Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment. After the break, we'll see how this well-educated conservative dynamo found the cause that would define her life and have long-lasting consequences for evangelical Christians. And while you listen to the ads, why not take a moment and share the show with your friends? Hop on social media and tell someone you know that you love truth. Welcome back. Phyllis Schlafly was absorbed with the political arena. She ran for office, she studied politics in her master's degree. Her writings advocated that the U.S. be isolationist, not engage in foreign wars. But until the early 1970s, she was not super involved in debates over feminism. She later said, and this is an actor reading the lines,
I figured the ERA was something between innocuous and mildly helpful.
The ERA, as a reminder, being the Equal Rights Amendment proposed by Alice Paul. Phyllis Schlafly didn't quite have it on her radar until a friend with a conservative talk radio show in Miami badgered her about what equality, not equality plus, could mean. She wrote about it for the first time in the February 1972 issue of the Phyllis Schlafly Report.
Of all the classes of people who have ever lived, the American woman is the most privileged. We have the most rights and rewards and the fewest duties.
She continued by making the argument for a traditional family structure.
Our Judeo-Christian civilization has developed the law and custom that, since women must bear the physical consequences of the sex act, men must be required to bear the other consequences and pay in other ways. These laws and customs decree that a man must carry his share by physical protection and financial support of his children and of the woman who bears his children.
She went on to call the family the single greatest achievement in women's rights, that children are basically the best social security and pension a woman can ask for. Remember earlier when her family didn't ask for welfare during the Great Depression? You can see how she continued that attitude when talking about old age pensions, wanting children to float their aging parents, not the government. She makes all these big claims about the ERA, some of them legit, and some are dicey. But they go back to the question from the top of the show, the disagreement between Alice and Esther. What should equality look like? Is it that the law treats women the same as men, or that they get equal treatment plus protections? Here again is the meat of the ERA.
Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
The ERA calls for total equality. Here's what Schlafly wrote in her newsletter.
This amendment will absolutely and positively make women subject to the draft.
If the U.S. can't deny or abridge a law based on sex, then, according to Schlafly, women would be pulled into the military draft. That was a really big claim in 1972, when the U.S. was still in Vietnam. She continued, another bad effect of the Equal Rights Amendment is that it will abolish a woman's right to child support and alimony, thus leaving the decisions of what happens to women in cases of divorce or abandonment up to the courts, potentially stranding single women with kids who may not have career experience to fall back on, according to Schlafly. Here's the rub. The amendment is really generalized. There are no provisions explicitly keeping protections women have, which, according to Schlafly, would go away once the ERA was established. Here she is from that oral history interview.
What I did really was to establish the battleground that we fought on. And the battleground we fought on was the legal rights that women would lose if ERA were ratified. And so my testimony was always, it was going to hurt women A, B, C, D. And their argument was Phyllis is a bad person. They were playing a defensive game, you know. They never went over the 50-yard line.
Her opponents often criticized her as seeing women only as housemakers. Then they accused her of hypocrisy since she was a woman who worked and was frequently gone from her 6 children. The trick is, Schlafly was okay with women working outside the home as her mother did and as she continued to do. She often said so. But as sometimes happens, the debates lacked nuance. She was clear that she wanted women to move up. Schlafly supported more women in higher offices and argued that those goals could be achieved by existing legislation like the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Rights Act, or by adding clearer language to the ERA to preserve the protections women already had in place. Despite her bluster, the ERA was passed by Congress in March of 1972 and then was put to the states to ratify, which many quickly did. Within 7 days, 7 states ratified. Schlafly's readers pounced in Oklahoma, passing out copies of her newsletter. Hearings were flooded with women who opposed the ERA, thus killing ratification in that state. People in Oklahoma reported back to Phyllis about their tactics, and soon, women in other states were doing the same things. For more insights, let's go to Angie Maxwell. She's the author of The Long Southern Strategy and a professor at the University of Arkansas.
I think Schlafly is one of the most important conservatives and most important political operatives and strategists of the 20th century, bar none.
Schlafly's turn against the ERA was music to the ears of the right wing of the Republican Party.
And so the second that she starts being the woman who is against the ERA, she is courted heavily and brought into more inner circles, higher and higher up within the Republican Party, because what is better if you want to kill the ERA than having a woman be the one who is saying it?
Remember, Republicans were the first to add the ERA to their platform. To implement her strategy, Schlafly founded Stop ERA, which stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. This is one of the geniuses of Phyllis Schlafly. She and a group of women founded the group as a single-issue organization. That made it easier to organize a wider base of women to get on board because it was a broad goal. She was a part of a whole mess of organizations, but they often specialized. It's much easier to build a coalition around one issue than it is two. And the coalition had the advantage. To pass an amendment, 3/4 of the states have to ratify, a minimum of 38. To kill the amendment, Schlafly only needed just over 1/4 to follow her.
And I think a lot of the feminists, understandably, just kind of didn't see it coming. Because it passes 30 states in a year. It's just unstoppable until it stops.
She knew that the South was where she could turn to block the ratification of the ERA. There was just one problem. She, the spokesman of the movement, was Catholic.
When you're trying to stop a certain number of states from ratifying, an amendment that passes with 90% of the vote through Congress, the southern states are smart places to look, but she was worried about the Catholicism. So she bridges and, she reaches out to women in the Southern Baptist Convention. And she uses the issue of abortion.
Which then was a Catholic issue. The Southern Baptist Convention was still largely okay with abortion by this point. But Roe v. Wade was decided just months after the ERA passed through Congress. Catholics called upon doctors not to comply with orders to perform abortions.
And connects it to the Equal Rights Amendment and feminism by portraying feminists as man-hating, baby killers, don't want to be mothers.
To be fair, it was true about some feminists, not all. It's a big tent.
Her organization, in connection with women who want to be women, put out these things called the Pink Papers, which are, just huge scare tactics about the ERA. If it passes, your husband can divorce you. He does not have to pay child support. He gets the kids. You'll have to get a job, right? It's just real extremists. And there were real things that people needed to debate about the ERA. It's complicated.
The Pink Papers were key, and you can still find them online today. One was called Ladies, Have You Heard? Here's an actor reading from it.
A tiny minority of dissatisfied, highly vocal, militant women insist that you are being exploited as a domestic drudge and a pretty toy, and they are determined to liberate you, whether you want it or not. What is liberation? Ask women in Cuba. Castro liberated Cuba, remember?
It was confrontational for sure, making big, fearful claims.
According to leading law councils, the ERA will permit homosexuals to marry and adopt children.
It quotes a legal scholar who said that the law, quote, would require that there be no segregation of the sexes in prison, reform schools, public restrooms, and other public facilities, end quote. And a bold title reading, Do you want your husband to sleep in barracks with women?
And those scare tactics really made some of these women nervous. And she got them comfortable going to meetings, and you have this phone tree and you have this phone tree, and we'll bake bread and we'll deliver it to the legislators and we'll have our message on it. She met them where they were.
She knew how to reach out to conservative women, many of whom had never been politically active before. Not to say conservative women were not active. The ERA passed Congress the same year as the Kanawha County textbook war I covered earlier this season. Conservative women were on the move, and many found their voice in fights picked by Phyllis Schlafly. By 1975, only 5 more states were needed for the ERA to pass. Schlafly was on the road, testifying in 41 state hearings. To the chagrin of feminists, she often enjoyed equal time along with them in broadcast debates, even though her positions were in the minority. At the time, there was an FCC rule in place known as the Fairness Doctrine. Since the airwaves for radio and television were considered to belong to the public, they had to serve the public good. Unlike today, they were required to cover both sides of controversial topics, even if the opposition came from a little slice of the electorate. That means that less popular ideas sometimes got full coverage. Schlafly used this rule to her advantage. If she didn't get equal time, she sued, strong-arming people via the courts to amplify her voice. One of her debates stands out to me. In 1973 at Illinois State University, Schlafly went up against Betty Friedan. Friedan was the author of The Feminine Mystique, and is often cited as the mother of the modern feminist movement. Schlafly argued that the feminist movement was marketed as a move to make women happy, to deliver them from their drudgery of homemaking. Yet, as Schlafly said,
You, Mrs. Friedan, are the unhappiest woman I have ever met.
Shots fired. As the debate went on, Friedan lost her cool, saying, You are a traitor to your sex, an Aunt Tom. You are a witch. I'd like to burn you at the stake. A story that Schlafly liked to retell, and uses proof that feminists were angry people, even though she picked the fight. The anti-ERA movement remained, for the time being, an underground force. They were not championed by a political party until the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. When President Ford took office in 1974, and he wanted to meet with the heads of national women's organizations, Ford, a Republican, did not invite the anti-ERA leaders to join the discussion. Though they got media coverage, they did not have the ear of the president. Remember how we talked a few episodes ago about fundamentalist Christians feeling like wounded lovers who just wanted to be taken seriously? Or Southerners feeling looked down upon? There's a real sense in these conservative groups that they just want to be at the table with the cool kids, to be mainstream. The same was true for Schlafly and the anti-ERA movement. They wanted a sense of legitimacy, even though they benefited in some ways by being outsiders. So when officials in Washington started planning a national conference to address women's issues in the United States, it stung when there was an absence of conservative women in the room. Instead, the organization was stacked with feminists from the middle and the left. Conservatives under the leadership of Phyllis Schlafly found themselves without a chair at the table. In the process, they kicked off something we're still experiencing today, the pro-family movement. We'll cover that soon. It's a wild story, but I needed you to understand Phyllis Schlafly first. Before we get there, I want to highlight one of her most enduring legacies, which might otherwise be easy to miss. If you remember from earlier this season, there was a pastor named Harold Ockenga, and of course, the evangelist Billy Graham, and together they started the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, in the hopes of uniting evangelicals so they could work together on minor political issues. But they never quite managed to unite people. Phyllis did. Her fights against the ERA and later for Ronald Reagan would unite two groups who had literally been fighting wars since the 1500s. In the 1970s, Protestants and Catholics teamed up in order to accomplish shared goals. But it didn't stop there.
And she reached to Mormons too. I feel like almost single-handedly, she wipes down some of those denominational divisions and divides.
Members of the LDS Church were key to the fight against feminism, despite there being a different religion. Mormon women from all over the country, not just Utah, were key to Schlafly's efforts to upset the National Convention. And we'll get there soon. She did what Ockenga and Graham could not do. She united the religious right, not around the figure of Jesus, but around politics and fighting certain kinds of feminism. She also activated conservative women who were not previously involved in politics. Phyllis Schlafly was a tough woman. When her critics attacked her claims about what the ERA would do, she went to law school during the ERA fight when she was also on TV and in debates. Mother of 6 children, political organizer, writer, also conspiracy theorist, and someone I think was pretty mean in her debates. The ERA has still not been ratified, though there are those out there who keep fighting the fight. When I hear discussions of how evangelicals got tied to the Republican Party, I mostly hear about race or Ronald Reagan, rarely about her. She was wildly important in bonding some evangelicals to the GOP. I'll continue the story in the next episode. I'm indebted to so many sources for this episode. I'll have a complete list on the website as I do for most episodes. I especially want to call out the book Divided We Stand by Marjorie Spruill, which covers Schlafly as well as the National Women's Conference we'll talk about soon. It's well written and blessedly annotated. You can hear hours of Phyllis's oral history on the website for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Angie Maxwell is the author of The Long Southern Strategy. You can hear more from her in my episode about that very topic just a few weeks ago. This episode took so long and a lot of effort. I read books, I searched for audio, I dug up original documents, then there's all the recording, editing, interviewing, uploading, and marketing. I'm doing the show while holding down a full-time job driving a school bus, and it's a lot, like a lot. If you'd like to help me make more thoughtful, original podcasts like this one, please consider praying for the show on a regular basis and for my stress levels while producing it. And if you'd like to give financially to help me get one step closer to doing this show full-time, you can give via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, or old-fashioned check. And people who give via Patreon will get special access to a bonus episode with Marjorie Spruill. Special thanks to everyone who gave their voices to this episode, including my incredible friend Jackie Hart and Amy Fritz of the Untangled Faith podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.